Welcome, everyone, to this amazing episode. I know you're going to love this episode. It's going to be great. Deconstructors Club. I'm your host, Alex Weiss. Your co-host, Bob Azarito, is here. And we have an amazing guest. We're going to talk a little bit more. Well, Bob is going to introduce him. And it's going to be amazing because as we've been telling you from last week, these next we're in 5 episodes. This is the second episode now. The next episodes, we're going to be talking about Christian nationalism, leading up to the election. So this is going to be pretty amazing. And we'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear your comments. We'd love to hear how this is helping you out in any way. But you're really going to like this. And so anyways, without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Bob Azarito to introduce our guest.
Alex, thank you. I hope you get well. I hope you don't pass it on to others as you're sitting around the house. But I too am
on Zoom.
Yeah. I'm very excited about having Dr. Matthew Taylor with us. And we'll talk a little bit about this fascinating book that just came out a couple days ago. Been in the works for a while. It's a little surreal for me to have Matt here because I'm very, very familiar with his story. I was good friends with his parents during the years that I grew up in Southern California. Went to the same high school as his mom, Debbie. She went on to be provost at Talbot Theological Seminary, where I graduated, where John MacArthur graduated. A little side note, I'm not sure what was it like in your household when you decided to go to Fuller rather than Talbot, Matt? But
my parents were fine with it.
They're probably fine. So anyway, I just so happy to have you here. I see little flakes of red hair reminiscent of your mom, and I just and she just retired too, not that long ago. So we're kind of approaching that time as well soon. Anyway, I just wanted to start off with something because we're called the Deconstructors Club, which means that we started this podcast. This is just our second season, but we started our podcast to be a place where people who are leaving evangelicalism, questioning evangelical theology, the evangelical system, and that can be kind of a lonely experience for many. Because there's not a lot of support within evangelicalism for those who might want to question evangelicalism. So I thought that maybe we could start by just telling us a little bit about your story, your growing up. How did you go from, growing up in a sort of an evangelical world, going to Fuller Seminary, and then coming all the way to write a book like this that was very challenging and had a lot of questions for this evangelical and the broadening evangelical movement. Could you do that in a short span of time, Matt? Would that be okay?
I'm not sure how short it'll be, but I'll do my best.
No, go ahead. We'd love to hear it. So.
I think a lot of times when we talk about this topic of deconstruction, I think a lot of people feel like they were pushed out of evangelicalism, right? That there was trauma, there was pain, there was disillusionment, and those factors kind of pushed them out. I would argue I actually was kind of pulled out of evangelicalism by Islam and by interreligious dialogue. So, like you said, I grew up evangelical. I mean, even in my youth, I think the term fundamentalist was still in use and was not seen quite as pejorative as it is today. And so I think at different points, my family might have been content calling itself fundamentalist. Went to University of California, Irvine, and got involved with this parachurch ministry called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship there. Did ministry with InterVarsity for about 7 years on campus. And while I was doing that, started going to Fuller Seminary. And I was really interested in Islam, and I thought for a while that maybe I wanted to be a missionary. And many of the people in my courses on Islam were missionaries or missionaries in training. And then I started realizing I don't know what I want to convert Muslims to, but I really like talking to them, and I really enjoy learning with them. And so I kind of realized I want to do dialogue. I want to and comparative religion and learn what I can from these Muslim thinkers and explore these convergences that I see there. And for if your task is interreligious dialogue, evangelicalism is a bit of an intellectual cul-de-sac. I mean, there's just not far that you can get in that, just even institutionally and in terms of training. And so that really kind of set me on a different path. And I wound up becoming a mainline Protestant. I moved cross country from Southern California to do my PhD at Georgetown in Muslim Christian dialogue. After I graduated, I got a job teaching and working at an interreligious institute, which is still where I work in Baltimore. And so I was kind of content leaving my evangelical background behind. And then January 6th happened. And I watched as I would argue that January 6th was in many ways a 9/11 type experience for evangelicalism, where in the same way that Muslims in America watched as their religious traditions, the symbols of their religion, the words of their scripture were abused and bastardized by terrorists to go and attack the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and these flights. I think in many ways we watched as the tools, the music, the theology of evangelicalism was mobilized for the storming of the Capitol, and it shook me to my core. I mean, I had lived in D.C. for a number of years. I love D.C. I love the city, and watching these places that I love overrun by Christians claiming that they were doing the will of God. I decided I needed to really understand what was going on here, and I had a lot of questions. I tried to figure out who were the leaders underneath that, and that has become my podcast and now my book.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, just to tell you about the book, I mean, it's well, I know you already realize this, it's well done. It's easy to read. It's very clear and really, really helpful. I also was looking at January 6th, watching what was going on. And it was like, why are crosses there? And why are, the same kind of questions you probably, what is happening here? All of a sudden, there's the presence of these symbols of faith and Christianity. And I was already long ago, I'd already left evangelicalism, but I was very shocked to see this. And you were extremely helpful in tracing where that came from. And that was, extremely helpful. Let me ask you a question, because I think people will have this question that pick up your book. Tell me about the title.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about The Violent Take It by Force. Where'd that come from, and why'd you choose that over other possibilities?
So that phrase, the violent take it by force, actually comes from the mouth of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus is reflecting on the death of his cousin, John the Baptist, which, at least in the cues we get from the text, seems to have happened fairly recently, in the moment that Jesus is speaking. And he has this very, very strange comment. And he says that since the days of John the Baptist, right, which is, right preceding the time that he's living in. Since the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. And Christians have gone round and round. What do you do with this verse throughout the centuries, right? And many Christians would say that Jesus is simply being descriptive. He's saying to be a person of the kingdom of heaven, you don't fit in the world, and so you're going to experience the violence of the world, right? That this is merely a description of the persecution that Christians will experience, like John the Baptist experienced. Other Christians have said that Jesus is using violence as a sort of positive metaphor. Be passionate, be violent in the way that you grab hold of the kingdom of heaven. And then for the rioters, of the Capitol rioters, they loved this verse. In fact, I found it all over the place in social media posts and comments that people were making on different podcasts. And it was just a verse that was constantly being referenced both in the lead up to January 6th and on the day of January 6th. And they understood this verse to mean that the kingdom of heaven was represented in the Trump administration. that the kingdom of heaven had found a particular resting place in the Trump administration, and that it was being taken by violence. That the stealing of the election, the quote unquote stealing of the election from Trump, as they understood it, was a sort of violence against the kingdom of heaven, and they had to take it by force. And sometimes they would even add the word, we have to take it back by force. And this was, and even though they were largely talking about spiritual violence there, this was a big part of the psyche of January 6th, the collective psyche of these Christians as they're coming in, this sense of imperilment, this sense of embattlement, this sense that we need to take back America, we need to take back our elections, we need to take back our country for God, and because we are the ones who are experiencing violence, so we have to do violence against these forces.
Yeah, and if not for your subtitle of your book may have been bought by a lot of people thinking it was going to be something else entirely. So the subtitle helps put it in context. And of course, in that section, Jesus is responding to John's inquiry. Are you the one, or do we look for someone else? Right. So Jesus wasn't acting even like John thought a powerful messianic deliverer should act. So it appears as though Jesus is bemoaning this approach of violence to that. So I agree with your interpretation of that section. But yeah, so when I went and Googled this title, I saw tons of books that were using it in a way that was very like, yeah, we need to take this, aggressively. One of the things you mention in your book is how most of these leaders of the New Apostolic Reformation, most of these leaders really were not supportive of the actual violence. You mentioned a lot of I think you mentioned one person that maybe was a little bit less embarrassed. But most of them were saying, we don't endorse. So talk about that a little bit. Does that just give them carte blanche? Does that just forgive them? Hey, we didn't intend this to happen. Talk a little bit about how that relates to what actually occurred on January 6th and what might occur again, potentially.
I think it's very hard for contemporary modern Christians to get into a mindset that says physical violence is a good thing, right? And this is true in general for most of humanity. Very few, even very violent people, imagine themselves as aggressors. They often want to, the way that we tend to rationalize violence is that person or that group or that idea is a threat to me. And I am the one who is embattled, and so therefore I have to be violent. I have to use preemptive violence or reactionary violence in order to overcome this threat to me, right? So we always want to think of violence as defensive, even when we're being aggressive with it. And so the leaders of the New Apostolic Reformation, who are really the characters of my book, these figures who I argue really were one of the driving forces of January 6th, at least in terms of the Christian mobilization around January 6th, they'll want to make a distinction between what they would call spiritual violence and physical violence, and say, we understand the role of the church is to do spiritual violence against the forces of evil, right? And they have a very elaborate demonology, elaborate conception of Satan and these hierarchies of demons, and they imagine that their participation in American politics, their participation even in an event like January 6th was about spiritual warfare, about battling back these demonic hordes that they believed were stealing the election. But even as they're saying these things and saying, oh, well, we love the people, we just hate the demons inside them, they also keep pointing at those people and saying, those people are filled with demons. Anyone who is our political opponent really is filled with demons. It is inspired by demons, and we must stop the demons. And it's this literal demonization of their political opponents that I think sets up a permission structure for the violence we see on January 6th. That we saw even Christians perpetrating. I mean, some of the Christians who go into the Capitol are still singing worship songs, are still singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, even as they come into the Capitol itself, as they've broken through these lines of police officers. They are still imagining that they are doing this righteous kind of violence, right? And so part of my argument is that what the NAR leaders help to do is create that permission structure, create the culture of violence, and then they showed up themselves that day to help orchestrate this spiritual violence. And so that is the inspiration for many of the Christians who showed up that day, and many Christians who were supporting the riot, who may not have been physically present that day, but believe that they were doing spiritual warfare in concert with the Christians who were present that day. And I think that has inculcated a sensibility, a willingness to entertain violence in a very large portion of the American Christian population.
Yeah, well said. I think that, to wash their hands of responsibility is always a bit odd, even as Trump washed his hands of responsibility and continues to do so. And I think most people are aware that there is a connection between the rhetoric and the actual practice of what happened. And so yeah, but I was shocked by the fact that there wasn't some sort of sensibility to see how this fervent, enthusiasm didn't sort of set the table for those who took it to the next, to the next step. And yeah, so a couple things. Alex, you can pop in here whenever you want. Yeah. I know that you're not feeling well, but feel free to. Usually that hasn't limited your ability to speak and participate, but feel free to jump in, because I'll just keep going. You got anything you want to add or ask at this point?
Yeah, it was interesting to me because my background is I come from Pentecostal movements, and then years later you were talking about how you were pulled into. I felt like I was pulled into the charismatic movement through networks that I was in. I don't even know how it just happened. It happened really quick, and before you know it, I'm sucked into this whole thing. One of the characters you're talking about. Cindy Jacobs, one of the main leaders. I had a chance to meet her. She had a chance to prophesy over my wife and I, give words. I was connected and worked closely with Lou Engle, who is the leader of, the large prayer movement in the United States and even beyond, doing thousands, gathering in his prayer movements or prayer gatherings. And so being a part of that, you get lured into it thinking that there's this spiritual warfare, in other words, and you're not fighting against flesh and blood. That's the portion they're taking from 2 Corinthians, right? We're not fighting against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and so forth, right? And so this idea of tearing down strongholds, this idea of doing it through prayer, give us a little bit of a context of how that works, because from what you were talking about in your book, like also some of the videos that are on YouTube about you explaining, this was the main Christian movement in January 6th. I mean, you're not talking about Southern Baptists being there or, other movements. How did they get to this point? What is the trajectory of them building up to this point? And why is it such a threat to what you would say democracy and faith in general?
The central character of my book is a guy named C. Peter Wagner. And Wagner, I argue, was both a theorist of this spiritual warfare idea, but then he was also a catalyst for galvanizing these charismatic movements around spiritual warfare, in particular forms of spiritual warfare that then, even though Wagner dies 4 years before the Capitol riot, we see all over the place. So part of the backstory here is in 1989, Peter Wagner met Cindy Jacobs, who you mentioned. And Cindy Jacobs understands herself to be a prophet, understands herself to have the special commissioning from God to deliver the words of God. And Jacobs had already begun to formulate certain concepts of spiritual warfare that then Peter Wagner picked up on as he began to mentor her, and then he kind of transformed into this framework that became part of the core of his movement. And the Wagner would make distinctions, and just to be clear, spiritual warfare is a very, very popular idea in Christianity. Mm-hmm. Many evangelicals, many Pentecostals, many Catholics practice spiritual warfare. So even though spiritual warfare is a central theme of my book, I'm not saying all spiritual warfare is bad or all spiritual warfare is abusive or political or whatever else. I mean, there's a lot of different forms of this stuff. And Wagner would distinguish three different kinds of spiritual warfare. He talked about ground level spiritual warfare, which is kind of, I feel kind of oppressed today. I just need to pray against the demons that are coming against me. Or, I'm feeling kind of down in the dumps. Maybe I should sing some worship songs to kind of lift my spirits and drive back these malign forces that might be oppressing me. So that's ground level, right? You're just dealing with your own personal demons or your family demons or whatever. And then he would talk about occult level spiritual warfare, where you try to track down the real world human institutions or communities that are evil, that are participating on the side of the demons. And they would point to communities of witches or even Muslims and say, the demon of Islam is in that mosque and we need to pray against that. They were very anti-Freemason. They thought the Freemasons were all occult practices. And so that's kind of the occult level, right? And you can see how it's kind of escalating. But then Wagner would talk about strategic level spiritual warfare. And when Wagner and Jacobs and these other NAR leaders started to read the book of Ephesians, and they encounter these phrases like principalities and powers, they interpreted that to be high-ranking demons, the kind of top-tier demons who they think are commanders of the demon hordes, who can control literal physical territory and human institutions. And so strategic level spiritual warfare in Wagner's framework means you need leaders like Cindy Jacobs, like Peter Wagner, who have a special authority, and they'll even call themselves generals of spiritual warfare, to cast out those high level, those principalities and powers, the territorial spirit kind of demons. And they both have an authority to cast those demons out, the highest ranking demons, but they also have an authority to mobilize Christians into campaigns of spiritual warfare, gathering hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions of Christians praying in concert in order to accomplish some spiritual victory, to conquer spiritual territory as they understand it. So part of what I'm trying to show in the book is that one of the major mobilizing forces of January 6th is this New Apostolic Reformation spiritual warfare campaign, orchestrated by people like Cindy Jacobs and Dutch Sheets and Lance Wallnau, that was intended to try to put Trump back in office, to overturn the results of the election. And that helps us to understand a lot of manifestations of Christianity we see at the Capitol riot, that especially if you don't have a background, as you do, Alex, in kind of Pentecostal charismatic Christianity. I mean, what are people doing blowing shofars at the Capitol riot, right? What are
weird
people doing,
stuff going on?
Why are people speaking in tongues at the Capitol riot? Why are people singing Christian worship songs while yards away they're like people clashing with police, right? That looks bizarre to us if we don't understand the vocabulary and the grammar of spiritual warfare that the people who are there at the Capitol are actually practicing.
So let me ask you, I have this question because I grew up under John MacArthur, who was preaching against the charismatic movement, from the beginning. He did these long series of sermons against the charismatic movement. So it's very surprising to me that he has now aligned himself with this movement. It makes me chuckle, but obviously everyone's doing it for like a different reason. And, somehow they're glad for the influence, they have to, just like Trump himself, no model Christian by any stretch of the imagination, but that's not the point of the support, actually, at this point. So, but the question I have is, I see the spiritual warfare, I see the energy, I see the enthusiasm worldwide. I mean, not just maybe mostly worldwide. In terms of the popularity. What's their goal? what if let's say they get someone, they take control of all of the mountains, they're what do they see as the end of it all? And then what happens to the rest of the people of the world who don't quite fit in with their vision? So can you speak to that a little bit? Because they're good at fighting. They're like, I remember with MacArthur, he always was fighting something. It was always against something. So anyway, when they win, what do they vision? What do they envision?
And I think just to make clear too, because I don't think we've mentioned it yet, but the Seven Mountains. If you mentioned Lance Wallnau, if we can kind of get that little bit of background and then be able to. I'm totally curious about what Bob is asking too.
So let me do a little of the backstory here. So after Cindy Jacobs and Peter Wagner start collaborating in the early 1990s, then Wagner becomes obsessed with this idea that Cindy Jacobs and other people are talking about, that we need modern day apostles and prophets to lead the church. And so it's in 1996 that Wagner helps to coin this term, the New Apostolic Reformation. He comes to believe that he is one of these latter-day apostles, that people like Cindy Jacobs is one of these latter-day prophets. And they come to believe that their movement, the New Apostolic Reformation, is a movement to re-envision the church, that it is a revolution in church governance led by these apostles and prophets that will be a reformation on the order of the Protestant Reformation. It will create an entirely new branch of Christianity that will lead the global church into revival. And so the New Apostolic Reformation really starts out as an ecclesial reform project, right? How do we use these kind of non-denominational, post-denominational models of apostles and prophets to change and revitalize the life of the church? And then in 2001, Peter Wagner meets this guy, Lance Wallnau. And Wallnau is a charismatic pastor, also playing around with a bunch of these ideas. And Wallnau has this prophecy that has kind of become his signature teaching. It's called the Seven Mountain Mandate. And the idea is, and he's kind of merging a bunch of different ideas into this Seven Mountains framework. But the basic idea is you envision the different arenas of authority or arenas of influence in society as mountains. So there's the government mountain, there's the family mountain, there's the religion mountain, there's the commerce mountain, there's the arts and entertainment mountain. And for every one of those mountains in every society, the tops of those mountains, the positions of control, are either held by God and Christians or Satan and demons. And there's no in between, right? It's Manichaean. It's one or the other. Good or evil is in charge of the mountains. And then the mandate is for Christians to conquer the seven mountains in every society, at every level of society. And that Christians are supposed to try to attain positions of influence or get their allies into these positions of influence so that Christian influence and Christian power can flow down into the rest of society. So if you think of like the model of the religious right of the 1980s and 1990s, it was a grassroots model of social change, right? We're the moral majority. We can mobilize Christian demographic power and use the mechanisms of democracy in order to enact a more Christian nation. This is a different model. This is a vanguard, revolutionary model. We take over the positions of power and then we let the change flow down into society. And so this idea radicalizes the New Apostolic Reformation in a new way. I mean, they were already pretty radical. I mean, they were already doing all these wild spiritual warfare practices and everything. But then now they have a political vision. And the focus shifts from we need to transform the church and reform the church into we need to conquer the world. And so they start putting together these programs of the Seven Mountains. You ask a really good question about what they want to actually have happen, and I would argue that they aren't entirely clear a lot of the time. So one of the characters in my book is this guy Che On, who's one of Wagner's mentees, very close to Cindy Jacobs and Lance Wallnau and all these people, one of the major NAR apostles. And I interviewed Che On and I asked him this question. And I was like, you guys, one of the other phrases that they'll use is they'll talk about, we are here to disciple nations, right? That's their interpretation of Jesus' Great Commission, right? Go into all of the world and make disciples of the nations. Most Christians throughout history have interpreted that as make disciples of the people of the nations, right? Go and reach all the ethnos, all the people groups of the world. But they understand that as disciple nations. Make the nation a disciple, make the nation Christian. And so I said, well, you guys talk about this a lot, but I feel like how do you get from here to there? So you say America has fallen away from its godly heritage, and we need to disciple it. But there's like a yada yada yada. Like, explain to me the process of how, because there's going to be people who don't want to be their nation to be discipled. There's going to be people who are not Christian, who do not want to conform to your vision of Christianity. Are you going to impose Christianity on them? Are they going to have the same rights as Christians? And he gave me a very, very revealing and very, very strange answer. And he said, when a husband and a father in a household converts, the whole household is better off. Because the husband won't abuse the wife or abuse the children, because now the husband has been converted to Christianity. And so in the same way, if we can convert the leaders of society to our vision, then the whole society will be better off. And there's something just unbelievably naive about that statement, as though Christians never abuse members of their household, as though, I mean, like the simple reading of headlines will tell you that is not actually how it works, right? That Christians are abusers. Christians have imposed their will. Christians gave us the Crusades. Christians gave us the Inquisition. Christians have given us pogroms and colonialism, right? Christians have abused their power throughout history. And to imagine that there's some innocence at the heart of being Christian that means that just because people become Christian means they're good, I think there's something so intentionally naive about that I find it quite troubling.
Yeah, and also the connection between January 6th and an evangelistic effort.
Yeah.
I mean, so we convert like Constantine at the tip of a spear. So obviously that's not a heart change. So it's an odd sort of thing. His question is interesting. You bring peace into the family, it benefits the children. I wouldn't disagree with that. But what's the connection between the methodology, of this new apostolic reformation and trying to bring joy and peace and wholeness to, in the lives of people? It's interesting that you're right. I don't think it's been a very well thought out, okay, how do we get from this controlling of the mountains to a peaceable world? And I think that's why Jesus didn't, in my view, when I look back at the story of the gospel, it was Jesus turning power away, not picking up the sword, telling Peter to put down the sword, not calling down the angels, not doing all these things that are happening, because it doesn't lead to what they, might think it's going to lead to, or all of a sudden we're just a better world because now we've got one person with a really, really big sword on the top of the mountain. So that's the part that's very unnerving. And by the time we get there and find out it's not working, do you already have a Putin or a, Orban or somebody, and you cannot really go back to democracy.
And it's worse than that, in fact, Bob, because so I get into, when I'm writing about Dutch Sheets, some of the distinctive theologies that he's brought forward, especially this understanding of ecclesia. So he takes this term ecclesia that we find in the New Testament. It means assembly, right? It's a synonym of synagoga, the synagogue, right? The gathering. And so the early church used this term, right? We're the assembly. We're the assembly of believers. And Sheets reads this, and he says, especially in Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus says, you're on this rock, on the rock of Peter, or on Peter's declaration, depending on your tradition, I will build my ecclesia. I will build my church. He understands that. He goes and says, well, the term ecclesia could be used in the Roman Empire to mean a legislative assembly, right? The same way that we will talk about state assembly as a legislative body. And so because that was another meaning of the word in the Roman Empire, this must be what Jesus means, that we as the church are the real legislative body on earth, that to be the ecclesia is to be God's actual government on earth, and that we just need to enact our will. And there's something so antithetical to me about the character of Jesus. I mean, the Sheets and Walnau and some of these other figures will even say, we are a colonizing force sent to bring the culture of heaven to earth. Because the Romans were colonizers and Jesus was watching their model, and he wanted his church to be a colonizing church. And I'm just like, Jesus also said, the lords of the Gentiles love to rule over each other. Mm-hmm. But not so with you, right? Jesus was executed by the Roman colonial empire. Right. Jesus refused to instigate an insurrection and rebellion against the Roman Empire. So this idea that they can appropriate the tools of empire, that they can read into the words of Jesus, the will to empire, and then that they can enact the empire of God on the earth through colonizing the earth. Somehow that does not trouble them, right? And they have a sense that because they are on the side of the angels, anyone who opposes them must be demons, and any impulse that they have must come from God.
And you know, wow. I know it's something else. That's one of the reasons why I deconstructed from all of that and pulled away from that, because common sense. I mean, I don't know. I'm just using that word, but it is. Common sense will tell you it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't align with the ethos or the ethics of Christ, right? It just doesn't. And so there was just so much that I was a part of, the inner workings and seeing these things. For instance, when it came to the prayer movement, it was a pro-life agenda. You know, that was their main thing. And they would do the protests in front of, Planned Parenthood with the life tapes on the red life tapes on their mouths. And, all of these things, there's this political, agenda behind all of it. And but it's interesting because I think you stated this. They don't understand that what they're causing is the chaos that January 6th basically, showed. They don't understand the consequences of what's happening to what they're causing, their movement is causing. And I'm so glad that you're highlighting this, because I see so many books right now on Christian nationalism, which I think is a big thing that needs to come out. People need to know, needs to be exposed. But yet this, in particular, the charismatic movement, there's not a lot written on it. There's not a lot out there. But yet you see they're the ones that basically have been in the forefront of these very aggressive moves, So first of all, I appreciate that you the book that you wrote and what you're doing right now. I think it's just so important coming from that movement. I see how dangerous it is. And I see how many people are being deceived and sucked into that movement because it demonizes the others. And it's just so easy to fall into that trap. And my question would be, what are things that we could do to help people basically shake free from this or begin to become aware? Or if they're already questioning, because I was one that was in the middle of it and I was questioning. I was like, this isn't right, Yeah. But yet at the same time, the momentum of it is so strong. What are ways that we can help people, break free from that if there is a way?
I think first off, we need to get educated about what's actually going on here. Part of the challenge is that we as Christians in the United States are so divided or so polarized that conservative Christians have a hard time speaking with progressive Christians and vice versa. And that's within Catholicism, that's within Protestantism, it's within the Orthodox Church, it's within the Latter-day Saint Church. I mean, we really have allowed politics to so infect our Christian discourse that we can't even see and speak to our sisters and brothers, right? And so Jim Wallace has this great comment about, in a democracy, you have to figure out who you can persuade and who you have to defeat. Mm-hmm. And I think the NAR leaders need to be defeated. I've talked to a number of them. They're not persuadable. They
No.
are so locked into their own power trip, their own ego trip, their own sense of self-righteousness that they're far gone. I mean, in the mercy of God, perhaps He can redeem them. But I have tried talking to them. They're not budging. Right. So many of their followers, though, are like you. They kind of get sucked in. It's like, oh, this sounds Christian. This sounds cool. Like, oh, power. I like power, right? Oh, wow. Like, look at these amazing worship experiences I'm having. I felt so met by God. Hey, if the prophet wanted to get up and talk about Trump after they prophesied over me, then that must be the real thing. That they must know what they're talking about. Because if they gave me a prophecy, then their prophecies about Trump must be accurate too, right? And so there's this way that I think people get drawn in and sucked into these circles. And there's something, the NAR these leaders are very, very good at making compelling memes, at presenting compelling experiences to people. And I think a lot of their followers are not even thinking about the implications of the seven mountains. It's like, oh yeah, Christian power. Christians should be powerful, right? And so there's a kind of tribal element and instinct that's there that I think we need to bring to the surface and confront. So I'm not naive though about how hard it is to have these conversations, but that's what has to happen, because the leaders in my book, none of them have faced legal scrutiny. None of them have faced congressional scrutiny for their participation in January 6th, because what they did, at least as far as I can tell, was within the bounds of the First Amendment. And we give a lot of protection for religious leaders and religious groups. And they can even use all this violent rhetoric, but as long as they're not instigating directly people to violence and pointing at a building and saying, go and attack that building or go and attack those people, within the way the Supreme Court interprets the First Amendment, there's a lot of license there. And so I think this is a civic reckoning that we have to have, and it's an intra-Christian reckoning that we need to have of holding our sisters and brothers in Christ accountable for the actual things they're saying and doing in the name of Christ, calling them out, confronting them, and I think we can do that graciously. But I think we also need to hold up to them and highlight for them and make clear to them the way that they are dehumanizing people. The way that they are dehumanizing Muslims, the way that they are dehumanizing atheists, the way they're dehumanizing witches, right? Like, I mean, part of the premise right now is there's witchcraft that is trying to steal the next election. And so then they'll go after people who actually do identify as pagans and as witches. I'm like, those people are also American citizens. Those people have every right that you have, right? And so we're in a pluralistic democracy that we don't get to impose our will. And why do you need America to be a Christian nation in order to validate your faith? Right? Like, Christianity has not done well when it's been enmeshed with political power. That is not a formula that has worked out well in Christian history. Christianity has done very, very well in terms of living up to the values of Jesus when Christians are actually on the margins of society, when Christians are serving the least in society, not taking over the most, right? And so I think we need to draw people back to the character of Jesus and help them to actually recognize when the gospel they're preaching is antithetical to the character of Jesus.
Yeah, whoa, man, well said, Matt. Yeah. Thank you so much for that, because I think as pastors of a small church, we have a lot of parishioners. It's a progressive church. There's nobody in here who's in our church that I know of closet Trump supporters, maybe, but most not. They're nervous. They're nervous about what they see. They're nervous about the totalitarian, authoritarian, that, sort of ways of looking, the idea of, not trusting a secular democracy to, not them, but the idea of these Christians not supporting a secular democracy. They think that democracy has gone wrong. It's gone haywire. It's allowed the demons to inhabit these places, and so they're nervous. They're very nervous, and of course we're trying to help them just hang in there. And the education is it started. We've read a lot of books on Christian nationalism, white supremacy, evangelicalism, but this is the first one that really has made sense of what's going on currently, and now trying to give a response to it. So what is our role? It almost looks like it's the monster's grown, the transformer has transformed too large for anybody to stop it. And so and I know throughout history, you see times where this has happened, and you have societies crumbling, and but I think there's sort of this idealistic view of America. Well, that will never happen here. That can't happen here. And I want to believe that too. I want to believe that our system is strong enough. So this is a very nerve-wracking time for a lot of folks. Is there anything you see that can be hopeful in your mind? I mean, I think your book is hopeful just by the education it provides, but in your interaction, in your conversations, in your interviews that you've done, is there anything that we can see that maybe there's a way to turn the tide, to give us something, Matt? What you got any hopeful words for our congregation and for our people out there who have they've deconstructed from evangelical? They're not a part of this, most of them, and so but they're seeing it and watching it, and maybe we've been asleep at the wheel a little bit by allowing this to go unchallenged in some respects. But any thoughts for us?
I mean, one of the sources of hope for me right now is I'm working with a number of Pentecostal and charismatic leaders. I mean, my book is about a set of Pentecostal and charismatic leaders, and my evaluation of them is that they are a threat to our democracy. But I'm working with other Pentecostal and charismatic leaders who inhabit the same media ecosystems, know many of the figures in my book personally, as you do, Alex, who are still in that Pentecostal and charismatic world, who find this stuff atrocious, who find it appalling, who are very anti-Christian nationalist, or who at least are resistant to the Christian supremacy. They might still want America to be a Christian nation, but are find what the NAR and these leaders are doing deplorable, and they're trying to find ways to push back, and that brings me hope, because I don't hold out much hope that I can persuade a lot of these followers myself, because it's easy for them to just write me off because I'm not a part of their world. They don't know my name. They don't trust me. Right? And they look at me as some egghead academic who's coming from the outside, and it's easy to caricature. Oh, he got his PhD, he must be a leftist, right? So it's easy for them to simply dismiss somebody like me. But here are insiders, people who they know, who I think could persuade, if they are willing to actually put their shoulder into it. And really, it takes a lot of courage in that world to stand up against this stuff. And there really is a force that is coming out of these NAR celebrities and their allies and Trump and Christian Trumpism that is bound to persecute a lot of Pentecostals and charismatics who don't get in line. But that's what it takes sometimes. I mean, throughout American history, what we today call Christian nationalism has always been a debate. It's always been there. It's always been a thread in our history that there have been Christians who've been arguing that America needs to be a Christian nation, that we need to Christianize the country, that we need to change the Constitution in order to make America Christian. And there have always been Christians arguing the other side of that. Always been Christians arguing in favor of separation in church and state. Always been Christians saying, hey, let's look at the lessons of history here. That Christianity and political power don't go well together. We need to protect the rights of religious minorities. We need to protect the rights of atheists and conscientious objectors to religion. And we need to be a pluralistic society. And I think we need to inhabit that other tradition right now, that the tradition of Christians advocating for the rights of religious and racial minorities and saying, hey, hold on a minute. Christian power is not the agenda here, right? The agenda is to build a multiracial, multi-religious democracy, which if we can ever accomplish it, and we have been stumbling our way towards it throughout American history with fits and starts and with a lot of backsliding, but if we can ever achieve that, it will be a modern miracle. Because that is something we have never seen in the history of the world, a stable and sustained multiracial, multi-religious democracy. That would be a true achievement. And I think that calls upon what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature in the United States. And I think we need to access those better angels, especially as you have people proclaiming themselves to represent the angels.
Matt, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, man.
What you're saying too, like for instance, I've been a part of those networks and I'm still in contact with several pastors because I was a pastor in those networks. And so there's people that I'm still in constant communication with, but I don't have a lot of resources for them except for what's out there with Christian nationalism, but they're on the charismatic Pentecostal side. With this resource, your book, and even these recordings, I think are very valuable to be able to help persuade, help influence them. They're already questioning. They're already open to things. They just don't know exactly if it's right to question. You know how it is. Yeah. If it's a right thing to push back. Are we really doing God's work by doing that? And so in being able to give them these resources, these tools, I think is very powerful. So we just want to thank you so much for coming on to our podcast today. And the book that just came out, The Violent Take It by Force by Dr. Matthew Taylor. I have it right here. I don't know if you can see it. Oh, it's blurry. Well, either way, there it is.
There you go.
He has it. Either way, we are going to be promoting it because we would love to see you with this book in your hands for all those that are watching us, for all those that are tuning in. I don't know, Bob, if you have any final words or anything.
I feel very, very proud to have been connected to your parents and all the work that you've done and representing the future, of our faith in some respects, to try to call us back to a place of love and sacrificial service, where we are best, and what that still happens. By the way, this isn't the sum total of Christianity, but what worries me is that it's really bad PR for our business as pastors. It's bad PR for those who are Christians, don't agree with that, don't follow that, believe that there's a lot of positive community opportunity among the Christian communities, a lot of respect for others who believe differently, a lot of understanding of how the public square is supposed to work. And I think your efforts here are going to go a long way towards inspiring others to speak out and to maybe begin, other books and other studies that could help our country find a center without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, I think not, people aren't trusting, people who are not a part of that are learning to not trust. It's already been happening, but learning to not trust the church, not trust the Christian message, not trust the good news, so to speak. But I'm hoping that it's not so far gone that we cannot, there's not some redemption maybe as we move forward. I mean, November 5th is a frightening moment for a lot of us because it depends upon, the fight will continue, the struggle will continue, but depending on, how that's going to look, will depend a lot, I think, on November 5th in some ways. So anyway, thank you. God bless you and your family. So I hope that you're, continuing on to, it sounds like you're in a good spot. So
I don't know if you have any final words, Matt, for us.
I'll just say, I think this is what we're coming into here is not a normal election. It is an election with a gun to the head of American democracy, where one side is saying, we'll accept the results if we win. And we already saw how that played out 4 years ago. So I think this is the most consequential election probably since the election of 1860 in terms of the very radically different trajectories our country will be on, depending on who wins this election and what the outcome of it is. And it won't be over on November 5th or November 6th. There's going to be contestation. There's going to be arguments. We're going to run the gauntlet as a democracy in the next 6 months. And I think we need to gear up for that. We need to get our heads and our hearts in that space to say, we don't take our foot off the gas on November 5th or November 6th. Like the movement to defend American democracy in some ways needs to kick into high gear on November 6th, right?
I agree.
Because there are going to be attempts to overturn this election, and Trump could very well win this election, in which case we need a principled movement to stand for democracy and oppose the authoritarian and despotic instincts of Trump. So I think as Christians, we just kind of need to get ourselves in that place of saying, I am a patriot, I'm a citizen, I'm a pluralist, and I'm going to stand for those things. And that might cost me something, because democracy is costly, but it's worth it.
Yeah. I would love to see a sort of a workbook come along with this with some questions. So I don't know if you're thinking about that, but this is I'm using this for a study in our church. I think it would be really helpful because a lot of this stuff is going to be new for many churches. But thank you for doing the work. I know you want to take a rest from after all that effort. It just came out. I hope you have great success with it, and that people take and you have the time to be a resource for people like us who are seeking to sort of understand and figure out what's an adequate response. How do we move forward? So
thank you for your support and for your help with all of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on our podcast, Matt. We appreciate you. Appreciate what you're doing. And hey, we'll be back on our usual studio setting hopefully next week. Hopefully I'll be feeling better. I'm sure I will be. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. This episode was an amazing episode, and please share it. Please share it. We need the word to go out. And just like how Matt was talking about, these kind of episodes bring awareness and education, and they're a big help. So, all right. Well, thank you. Thank you all. And until next time.